Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the Load Forecasting and Electric Utility Integration Resource Planning webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Should you wish to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Monday, November 21st, 2016. I would now like to turn the conference over to Mr. Juan Pablo Carvalho. Please go ahead.
Welcome everyone to this webinar on this Monday, November the 21st. I am Juan Pablo Carvalho, one of the authors, and I'm joined here by Alan Stanstead, one of my co-authors. We will be going through our summarized version of our report, Load Forecasting in Electric Utility Integrated Resource Planning. The background for the study is largely an examination of the Integrated Resource Planning tool, IRP, which is currently used by around 30 U.S. states. It's a tool that was developed in the early 1970s. Mainly as a way to improve and enhance the adoption of demand response and demand-side management in utility resource planning. The tool aims to determine least cost and manage risk, supply and demand-side resources to meet future obligations to customers. IRPs are developed periodically. Depending on jurisdiction, the frequency of filing can range from even a year to up to 5 years. And these plans have turned into a collection of important assumptions and information about the methods and strategies that utilities are using to think about the future and to deal with uncertainty and manage risk. However, even with the relevance of IRP, there's little to no empirical research on the outcome of the planning process, particularly in how it relates to procurement. In our research design, we have our main concern is how does planning connect to procurement. So our overarching question is how does procurement relate to planning? Would procurement be different to plans, or would it be similar to plans? And this is actually a question that we are answering in more detail in our second paper. But in this first paper, we focus on the inputs to the resource planning process. And the main input for this process are load forecasts, which are the cornerstone of resource planning. So in this presentation and in this paper, we're focusing mostly on answering questions like how did load forecasts perform for plans developed in the early 2000s? How did this forecast and their techniques have evolved in the past 15 years? What are the types of sensitivities that are used to test load forecasts, and how are they implemented? And finally, how does the load growth and forecasts relate to resource expansion? We are going through this first paper mainly to have a good idea on what is the role of load forecasting. So when we develop our second paper, our second analysis, we have a fairly good idea on what is the role that forecasts themselves play, and then we can also include and analyze other remaining assumptions. Just a quick overview of previous research. There's kind of 3 lines of related research in resource planning. One is one of the most common ones is called best practices research line, which essentially compares how LLCs have developed their plans and how these have evolved in time. And there's sort of authors that have both in the early 1990s and more recently have examined these different practices. Another set of type of research is what we call normative practices, which is more or less a critical view on the theoretical aspects of how plans should be conducted. And this was largely examined by Eric Hurst in the early 1990s. And we found very little quantitative work comparing demand forecasts in reality to what they were planned. And when that happened, it was either at the national level, so it was a broad energy comparison, or it happened at the distribution level, like very, very narrow and in-depth within the power system. And even in these cases, these analyses have not focused on comparing how eventually load and procurement of resources equalize. For this work, we have focused on the western U.S., largely because these states have been filing resource plans for over 2 decades, and some of them even 3 decades. We have chosen early 2000 plans for a set of reasons. One of them is that going back in time, there were very few LLCs that were filing comprehensive plans. So there were, in the earlier days, for some jurisdictions, the plans that were being filed were relatively simplified, so we didn't have enough assumptions or the information that we needed to run our analysis. The second reason is that we wanted to be a little far away from the California crisis that still had an influence in this plan. So our earlier plan is from 2003, and our older plan in this batch is from 2007. And so we have something between 12 and 8 years of data to compare against. We do acknowledge that we have the economic crisis right in the middle of our period of analysis. But we believe that this crisis may play in our favor because it provides a unique stress test for the resource planning process. In many respects, whether resource plans were prepared to handle such an event or not, and how the load forecast sensitivities and in general the planning process went about handling this crisis. It provides us with a unique framework to understand what potential improvements could be done to the planning process. As you may see in this slide as well, we have not included the California IOUs in this analysis, mostly because the LTPP process that California uses is not really as similar as the IRP process developed in the other states that are included in this analysis. So we decided to leave them out for this work. In any case, the LLCs that we are including here represent around a third of the sales of WEC. So it's a relatively representative sample. You can see here, just in a simple table, the first year, the year for the first plan, sorry. And we have also included in our analysis the most recent plan we had available for each of the 12 LLCs in our sample. The main reason why we do this is because first, we wanted to compare the load forecasting techniques and methods between these two in this period, and largely to make sure that our recommendations were still valid. And that is something that fortunately we found, that very generally the methods and techniques have not changed importantly. So we believe our suggestions and findings are still applicable. There were some changes, and I will go over them a little later on. But we believe that our analysis is very applicable to current-day resource planning. In terms of methods and data, this type of retrospective analysis essentially aims to compare data from older plans, forecasts precisely, from older plans, as I mentioned, filed in the early 2000s, and compare them against actual outcomes. For load forecast assumptions, we are using a tool developed by LBL called the Resource Planning Portal, which is a central repository that holds information from around 100 resource plans ranging from the early 2000s to the most recent ones. So the 24 plans that we use in this study, the 12 earlier plans and the 12 recent plans, are all stored in this resource planning portal that you're more than welcome to visit and gain access to. It's a free access. And you can have access to, as I mentioned, over 100 resource plans with their assumptions. For the actual data, we use the Ventyx velocity suite tool, that essentially holds information from EIA Form 861 and 923 and some others equivalent forms that essentially hold information on the actual energy consumption for different retail classes and peak demand load. We also calculated incremental procurement by downloading the most recent list of plants at the unit level, and then parsing out the plants that had been deployed and that had been retired within the period of analysis. One of our first results or findings is to classify the types of modeling approaches for load forecasting, and this is mostly for our own structuring of the analysis. We found, or we classified existing techniques in 4 different categories. 2 of them are more econometric, either time series regression or cross-section regression, which are the most commonly used, and particularly the cross-section regressions. Then we classify and we use an engineering model to refer to models or techniques that are more relying on particular features of end uses rather than historical data. And finally, one well-known tool is the seasonally adjusted end use model, the SAE model, that in our sample was not readily used. There were only 3 LLCs that were using this model explicitly, and these are all the results from the earlier plans. What you can also see is that most of the LLCs use these techniques for residential and commercial customers. In most cases, if not all of the LLCs, the industrial customers are examined in their own specific way, mostly relying on account managers and direct contact with the larger industrial customers. We analyzed further these methodologies by trying to understand what are the types of variables that were included in the techniques and the analysis. And we do this because we wanted to classify the complexity of the model. This is a coarse classification, a simplified classification that depends mostly on our assessment on the number of variables and the complexity of the formulas themselves. Most of the LLCs offered a detailed account of the formula and the math behind their load forecast methodologies, usually in the appendixes. And we classified the methodologies as you see down here, in a low, medium, or high complexity. And one of our objectives in doing this was to understand whether more complex models would yield better forecasts. And this is kind of an interesting question because what we saw by comparing the older plans with the newer plans is that there was indeed a important amount of new information being included in the new plan. So the bulk of the work for resource planning had been expanding significantly in those 15 years. And we were still curious whether there were empirical support for that level of complexity. Just briefly, what you see here is that historical sales and cooling and heating degree days are the most used variables for all types of customers. And it's particularly important to focus on historical sales because we believe that relying in history may have had an impact on the results of a load forecast, particularly with the crisis, the economic crisis. So in terms of change in load forecast methodologies, what you're seeing here is a visual representation of our assessment on how much the techniques and methods changed. And to make this assessment, we analyzed 3 different categories. We compared the analysis framework, we compared the techniques themselves, and we compared the key data sources. So from where are the LLCs obtaining their data from? what we find is that in general, as I was mentioning earlier, there was little change in around half of our sample, and only the load-serving entities in Nevada Power and Sierra Pacific, suffered from more important changes due to regulatory changes that happened in that jurisdiction within our analysis period. What we also found was a convergence in the key data sources. So key data sources here mean that the forecasts for economic growth, population, and other assumptions that are usually non-electrical are most commonly acquired by LLCs from external sources. In the earlier plans, we found a host of different providers for these sources, ranging from consultancies to academic bodies and institutions to state bodies. However, in the most recent plans, what we found is that there was a convergence towards one provider, IHAS Global Insight. And we have hypothesized whether this may or may not be a good thing. And in this, what we're thinking is that when we compare these analyses and we aggregate all the forecasts and their outcomes, if everyone is following the same forecasting source, and that forecasting source tends to be either right or wrong, then all the results will be correlated, more correlated than they were before. And that may have an impact on the aggregate, because if, for example, that forecast were to be wrong, then the bulk of the LLCs following that would be wrong, and that would create an aggregate, a larger impact than if these were different data sources that possibly could not be correlated. This is just an interesting observation, and we didn't delve in much further, but we were surprised by this finding. So going into the quantitative results, this first table that I am sharing with you shows the cumulative energy consumption error. What we are doing here is we are quantifying the error year by year from the start year of each one of these LLCs to 2014, which is the last year for which we have data. We're computing the error both negatively and positively. So we are not getting the absolute value of the error. We're just adding it because we believe that in the long term, if you have some years negative and some years positive error, for a long-term resource plan, it makes sense that it pans out in the long term. So we're doing that on the first column. On the second column, we are adding all the load in the same period of time, just to be able to get the ratio and get what we call a calculated proportional error. And what we found here is that the ranges for these errors were pretty staggering, ranging from very accurate forecasts in the LLCs that are down here in the table at the bottom, to larger errors around 20% for General Electric in the upper side of the table. And rather than explaining particularly the sources of these errors, what was interesting for us is that the typical comment that people say that forecast is always wrong, we tend to agree with that, but we do believe that there are differences, and this table is showing that for some reasons that we will offer some hypotheses for, some LLCs are getting their forecast much more accurate than others. Now, there are a couple of reasons that we explored to understand what's going on in here. We did find that the load-serving entities with a higher share of industrial load had less accuracy, and we believe that this is because industrial load is very elastic, particularly to economic growth and economic performance. So the load-serving entities that have a higher share of industrial customers do tend to have a harder time to predict the load for their customers. This also relates to the fact that most industrial customers will let the LLC in their service territory know when they're either arriving to a new service territory or when they are expanding their operations, but we rarely give advance notice if they're closing their operations. So there is an asymmetry there that makes it harder even to predict. how these industrial customers will behave. We think this suggests that, and this is kind of a first insight for the planning process, that a separate type of load forecasting and sensitivity should be performed for industrial customers, and possibly their load and their load forecast should be assessed quite differently and in a different framework compared to residential and commercial loads. What we also found is that the LLCs that are larger in size or have a more diversified load tend to have a reduced error. And we believe this makes a lot of sense because larger LLCs, they have possibly service territories in several different states. I'm thinking in terms of, for example, Pacificor, which is one of the larger LLCs that we analyzed. From the law of the large numbers, their errors in different service areas and in different geographies tend to average out, and they tend to be a little more accurate. And this is obviously a structural reason. It's difficult. It's not an argument to make and to merge LLCs into larger bodies just to reduce load or to improve load accuracy. It's a structural reason. Finally, in answering one of the first questions we've asked is that while we did find that the model complexity may improve results, we do believe that there were very small marginal benefits to the performance of the load forecasts and their accuracy. So in this next couple of slides, we open up by showing the time component, and what you're seeing here is in red the base forecast energy consumption for each of the 12 LLCs, and in blue the actual outcome for the same group. In gray, you're seeing the range spanned by the load forecast sensitivities. In most cases, load-serving entities will be will provide an upper and a lower bound for the forecast, and we have included that in here. And in a fewer cases, there are statistical or stochastic analysis that use distributions. So in those cases, we have selected the 10th and the 19th percentile to signal the upper and lower bound, and we have displayed them here. What we see here in this results are that, first of all, there were, in watching the blue line, some LLCs were surprisingly resilient or less sensitive to the crisis, where others were much more sensitive to, especially to not recovering as fast. Secondarily, half of the load-serving entities had negative growth in the period analyzed, and only 2 had growth rates that were somehow similar to what they had planned for. And these 2 were LLCs that were larger in size. We also find that in terms of energy consumption, there was a relatively high correlation in terms of where the actual outcomes went. So as I mentioned, most of the outcomes were with a very small load growth or no load growth at all, creating larger gaps between the load forecasts and the actual outcomes. And I make this point because in the next slide, I'll show the peak demand. And peak demand had much more mixed results in terms of that there were some load-serving entities that saw peak demand go above their forecasts, and some others that saw peak demand, actual peak demand, go below their forecasts. Now, a caveat here is that we did not, because we were not able to weather normalize the peak demands that are included in this chart, but we believe that those wouldn't have had a really important impact because we did study the cooling degree days and heating degree days in our period, and they were not abnormally out of the average for the same period. So maybe the exception are the last few years, 2014 and 2015, were abnormally cold or hot, sorry. But otherwise, we don't believe that it's a large distortion for our analysis. And one of the insights that we get from peak demand is first that it's much harder to predict peak demand error, or to predict peak demand and to reduce the error of peak demand compared to energy. Mostly because of the water sensitivity, but also because of the elasticity of peak demand to economic performance. We found that it was much higher sensitivity compared to energy consumption, and this makes peak demand harder to forecast. We also recorded that many load-serving entities were reporting that peak demand during the economic crisis had not fallen as fast as energy consumption, which meant that the load factor for most of these loads was getting worse, so that there were higher peak demands with lower overall average load. And this is always problematic for rate setting and puts some pressure on rates that are connected to being recovered through peak demand charges. As part of our analysis, we studied the sections on resource planning related to load forecast sensitivities. And we did this because we wanted to understand what was the response of the load-serving entities to the possibilities that their load forecasts would not be accurate and would not match the actual outcomes. We found that there were two general types of approaches to load forecast sensitivities. The first is what we call the testing of the preferred portfolio. And what utilities are doing here is taking their preferred portfolio, once they have analyzed all the possible portfolios, and they just check what are the cost differences if there was a different load forecast applied. So meaning that there were excess capacity if the load forecast was below, or the actual outcome was below the load forecast, or deficit if it was the other way around. The alternative that was used more commonly was to develop a different plan. So it was to usually take the preferred portfolio and either add a few resources or subtract a few resources to meet a new load forecast, and then assess the cost difference in these. What we also found is that most LFCs had migrated from earlier scenario-based analysis, which tested one variable at a time. For example, tested either an upper and a lower bound for load forecast, or maybe an upper and a lower bound for natural gas prices, to a more recent stochastic and comprehensive analysis that aimed to define a comprehensive scenario for the economic performance that includes not only load growth, but also other important components that are correlated, like natural gas prices or population changes. And in this way, these utilities create whole new futures in which they can design new alternative plans. And we believe this is a good sign and a good evolution for sensitivities, particularly for load forecasts. Going back to the design of alternative plans, we studied what was the effective revenue requirement from these load changes. So this is the third point in this bullet list, and I want to take some time here to explain what we did here. So there are, in the resource planning process, one of the important parts of it is to create several different portfolios and compare them in costs. There's also a risk comparison, but let's focus for now on the cost. And what's done here usually is that there are usually 7 to 12 and at times 20 different portfolios being created, analyzed, and assessed in monetary terms. And usually the least cost portfolio, or a group of least cost portfolios, is then later studied in terms of risk. And the difference in cost between these portfolios, we found them to be relatively small, in the order of 1 to 2%. What we did find is that the portfolios that were developed as part of the load sensitivity analysis had a much larger difference in monetary terms. This means in revenue requirements. So a portfolio that has to meet a lower load versus the portfolio that has to meet the expected load has a revenue requirement difference of between 10 or 15%. And for us, this was a very interesting finding that suggests that there may be a lot of gains into analyzing in much more detail the impacts of load forecast in terms of costs, rather than spending too much time comparing the portfolios between themselves, because the revenue requirement impact is much larger for load changes rather than portfolio changes. Finally, what we find after examining all these load forecast sensitivity sections in the resource plans was a general absence of methods or strategies to respond to alternative load growth. So the analysis was there, but in just very few cases we saw mentions of what would the utility do where this particular either low or high load forecast materialized. The few strategies that we found were resource flexibility, which essentially is purchasing or focusing on purchasing resources that are quicker to deploy and that do not have a high capital cost, namely gas turbines. And alternatively, to rely on market transactions, short-term market transactions, to fill in as a buffer for shortages or excess of resources. And I will not go in detail in these two, but they do have certain limitations. And want to also caveat that we understand fully that resource plans are not operational plans, so they're not supposed to exactly describe how procurement will happen, and they're supposed to inform procurement but not describe it. But we still believe that plans would have benefited of laying out a strategy of adaptation a little bit more clearly, at least for the public scrutiny. The next step in our analysis involved what we call analyzing subsequent RFPs. And what we did here is that we had the older set of plans from the early 2000s and the recent set of plans from the years 2013, 2014. For the LFCs that we had available, we gathered load forecasts from all the plans that were filed in between those periods. So in this case, we selected Avista because they filed pretty much annual updates to their resource plans and their forecasts. And what we see here is that there is a systematic or sustained overestimation of load forecast in this period. What we do see as well is that the slope of these forecasts, ranging from the earlier ones in the 2005 to the latest ones, the slope is going down slowly, which means that there is an active effort to improve these forecasts. But insofar these calculations depend on historical sales and cannot include new information as fast enough and with the right weight, we believe this forecast will continue to behave as you see here in this chart. In this next slide, we include the same calculation for Idaho. Due to limitations on effort, we only produce these charts for Idaho and Avista, but this we examine numerically the results for the other load-serving entities, and this is a widespread phenomenon of overestimation. Now, we wanted to offer a couple of hypotheses here in terms of what's going on, because what many observers have noted and have tried to deduce from these results is that there is a ever-present Albert-Johnson effect, where the LLCs have an incentive to overinvest, and to support that overinvestment, they overestimate their forecasts. And while that is a plausible explanation, it's only an hypothesis, and it's actually really hard to prove that. We did not try to explain these results of overestimation, but we did think and offer a couple of other hypotheses. One of them is that there is a natural tendency to want to err on the high side, on the upper side, because there is a very asymmetric result. If load forecasts were to be short and the market was not able to provide that additional resources, then there will be blackouts or brownouts, and that has a much larger societal impact than some fraction of cents increase in the tariff to have those additional resources. So that's one structural problem that has been present in the utility business model for forever, pretty much. There's also what we found many utilities were reporting pressure from both regulators and public and other stakeholders to have higher reliability levels, particularly after the California crisis that had those rolling blackouts that were very impactful. So there was some pressure to have higher reliability levels and higher reserve margins that may have prompted a larger acquisition of resources. So we believe there's a third reason to eventually the load forecast may be higher, but I'm going to go over those in this next slide. So by the end of this paper, what we did is to compare load against resource planned and resource procured. So what you're seeing in this chart is at peak capacity. So at peak capacity meaning that for all the supply side resources, we derate their nameplate capacity in terms of their contribution to peak. And we use very conservative values for this. And we separate the resources in contracts and in self-builds. So in this period, the aggregate incremental plant resources were roughly 12 gigawatts by 2015, whereas in reality, the aggregate was a little bit below in around 11 gigawatts. And the mix of contracts and self-builds or owned resources was pretty much maintained. We can also see in the actual procurement a clear break in 2008, possibly due to the economic crisis. However, when we compare and impose here the load values, we find a striking result that whereas in the planned case, resources seem to be somehow correlated to load, and it was very consistent in terms of growth. In the actual panel, load was flat for the most part during this period, but resources still climbed. Now, the two hypotheses that we offered earlier are still applicable. We also believe that there may be a third hypothesis in which the higher presence of some variable renewable resources, particularly wind, in WEC, may have prompted the need for additional capacity to be installed, particularly gas turbines, to provide flexibility to the system. And while we have not examined these in detail, we believe that that is a plausible explanation. But as I mentioned, we did not focus our analysis in explaining this behavior, and we have just offered a set of hypotheses for it. So in terms of conclusions, just wrapping up the presentation, we do find a sustained overestimation of load in older and subsequent IRPs, and we have offered a set of hypotheses to explain or suggest explanations to what may be going on. We do find what we think is a small marginal benefit to model complexity in terms of improved accuracy of load forecasts, and we believe this may inform efforts to maybe not focus on making more and more complex and detailed load forecasting models, but better to design mechanisms to deal with uncertainty in an actionable way. That's the third point in our bullet list. We did find that procurement followed planning, but that actual load was significantly smaller than forecast, as I just shown in the last slide. And finally, that load forecasting techniques present little to no change in general in time. And again, we believe this make these analyses very applicable to current planning efforts, and our recommendations as well very much applicable as well. I just want to take a few seconds to acknowledge many researchers and governmental officials that and utility planners that provided very useful input in the process of developing this paper, and also to acknowledge the funding of the Department of Energy for this work. My contact information is there, and you can find us on emp.lbl.gov for other work, and particularly the second paper that should be out within the next couple months, in which we, as I mentioned earlier, we do compare procurement and planning, and we try to explain potential differences and similarities. So I want to thank you all very much for attending this webinar. We are taking questions over the chat that I'm going to go over now.
You see the questions on the chat?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I'm going on the first question. It says, which one of the LLCs makes use of a spatial forecast method, and how do they perform compared to other methods? That's an interesting question. I'm assuming by spatial forecast method, I am assuming a method that is especially explicit, meaning that I'm interpreting the question. I'm thinking that it means that utilities have explicitly modeled the location of their loads, and therefore are able to include geographically sensitive parameters on those. In general, I would say we did not find a specific opening in terms of in spatial terms. Usually, forecast techniques open their results in terms of customer classes, residential, industrial, commercial, more commonly, and at times dividing some of those in small, large, commercial, or specific classes of industrial, depending on the activity. I don't believe in our analysis that we saw a very specific spatial component, maybe with exception of very large LLCs that have operations in many different states, and they do calculate state-specific forecasts, mostly because, in general, because they are developing resource plans that have to comply with different jurisdictional requirements. And so the main reason to develop these forecasts by state is not really to capture particular spatial heterogeneities, but mostly to be able to comply with state-level regulations. So I don't think I have a full answer in terms of saying how it would perform, a spatial forecast would perform better or not, because we did not find in the earlier plans that there were specifically or explicitly spatial components included. A second question says, rather than just industrial load.
This is Alan. There was a second question, actually, I may not have been highlighted to the group, which was most of the utilities presented show higher energy forecasts than actuals. Could this be because of initiatives like demand-side management and other energy-efficient appliances, perhaps? So that actually, excellent question, and we start getting at that in our second paper. The short answer is basically not much. In our detailed case studies, we looked at this, and for Avista and Idaho in particular, both of them recorded in subsequent IRPs that there had been a greater than expected effect from DSM. At the time of these older plans, they were already starting to, by requirement of the regulations governing IRP, they were starting to deal with DSM. But roughly speaking, the effect of DSM appears to have been an order of magnitude or two smaller than what seems to have been the effects of the recession. So the answer is essentially yes, there was some effect, but it was relatively very small relative to what seemed to have been the main effect, which is economic growth and corresponding population and customer growth.
Thanks, Alan. I would also like to add as a clarification something that I did miss when I was given the webinar, that for all the load comparisons, we did subtract or net out the forecasted demand side or demand response and energy efficiency. So we could compare apples to apples in the sense that the actual growth obviously incorporates any energy efficiency measures. So we netted out the forecasted demand side management measures from the original load forecast to produce kind of a net load forecast. And in this way, we believe we're comparing much closer variables. So we're going back to the questions. There is a question here stating that rather than just industrial load, doesn't the share of non-residential, including commercial, influence the extent of forecast error? And that's an interesting question that we did examine a little bit. In most of the plans that we analyzed, the techniques for commercial load forecasts were very similar to residential load forecasts. And in some cases, some LLCs were using residential load forecast as a proxy to commercial. We found that in general, the projections for population growth and economic performance that affected residential loads were also used to predict commercial loads. So in that respect, we do still believe that industrial load is in itself a much particular category than industrial commercial. So in a way, we do think, and as many LLCs do, that grouping residential and commercial tends to make more sense from a methodological point, and that industrial loads are in their own category. However, it may be true that forecast error may depend on the non-residential portion rather than the industrial portion itself. But as I mentioned, I do believe that our results still support the idea that industrial customers are the most difficult to predict and the most elastic to economic performance, and also because their lumpy nature makes them loads that are not really atomized. So one or two industrial customers that either shut down their operations or enter a service area can have a huge impact that is equivalent to many, many commercial and residential customers making the same decisions at the same time, which is much more likely. A third question talks again about industrial loads and asks if there were trends by industry types, and give an example on whether auto manufacturing, for example, could show similar or dissimilar results to semiconductor industry. This is a very interesting question, and unfortunately, we did not have the time nor the data to delve and see if this is the case on whether essentially what's being asked here is if there are industry types that are more elastic or less elastic or resilient or more resilient or less resilient, and therefore making their load forecasts particularly more accurate or not. Unfortunately, we did not examine this particular question, but it will be very interesting to, as part of our suggestion, to delve in much more detail in industrial load forecast sensitivity rather than overall load forecast sensitivity. As part of the suggestion, maybe it would be warranted an examination in the lines of these questions to discover whether there are certain specific industry types that shouldn't receive much attention because they're more resilient and their forecasts are easier, and there may be others that have to be much more honed down in terms of their accuracy. The last questions that we have from the audience is if historical performance is a major variable in the models, why are the model slopes in your last two slides continue to be similar, parallel, upward? This is a good question, and I actually did mention in the case of Avista that while the slopes are upward, they're not really parallel. Let me see if I can move the slide back just to make this point. In this case, you can see comparing the leftmost curves as slopes to the rightmost curves, how the slopes keep going down and are somehow incorporating the results of the more recent actual outcomes, which essentially is a flat growth. And so we do believe that the slopes are coming down, which means that new information is being incorporated. But however, what we did we did say is that the speed at which this was happening was not fast enough. A caveat there that many LCs mentioned is that they truly expected the economic crisis not to be as deep as it was, and they were afraid of a rebound effect after the crisis that could have positioned them could have left them in a bad resource position without enough resources to meet demand in the subsequent years. So there may be that may be an additional explanation to why they were overly conservative in reducing their load forecasts. But we do see the slopes coming down as we expected from an integrated process that includes historical sales.
Yes, I'm going to elaborate on that point, which is that in the case of the case we're looking at here in our case studies of Avista and Idaho, it was clear that in historical information, the default here was up to the time of the original IRPs, with 2005 in the case of Avista, 2006 in the case of Idaho. So they continue to rely on that, but as JP just pointed out, it was getting updated by current information. But I want to amplify what he said. It was very clear in reading their subsequent IRPs that all following the recession or the onset of the recession, it was clear that they expected growth to rebound because relatively soon, because it was considered up for a while, for actually a number of years, to be sort of a standard business cycle phenomenon, and that reflected especially the macroeconomic forecast they were using, which at that time, a few, I think both, if I recall correctly, both Idaho and Avista were using at least some of mostly relying on external consultants and other sources, including IHS, but some others too. So virtually everybody or every entity that was putting out macroeconomic forecasts during those years underestimated how the depth and the longevity of the recession. And this is a lot of what's reflected here. The recession that started then turns out to have been a so-called black swan event, and we're still dealing with it. So clearly not following a historical business cycle pattern. I guess I would say that this sort of highlights what the relative importance of different drivers are. So here it's a very good example of the economic driver being extremely important in determining both in determining actual load growth, but also in influencing the degree of accuracy in the IRP's load forecast.
Thank you, Alan. And just to wrap up, one of the main conclusions that we got from this study, that it's more a little bit food for thought and something we are exploring as part of the prescriptions that we're developing in our second paper, is that how important is to get accurate forecasts? That's kind of still an open question, but in this paper we have hinted to that question, and in our opinion, they may not be as important as we think, and there may be other important portions of the resource planning process that may need to receive more attention and effort. For example, how to deal with the uncertainty and the fact that load forecasts may continue to be wrong, and while we still want them to be bounded in terms of their accuracy, maybe developing ways and specific strategies and actionable strategies to inform the stakeholders how utilities plan to go about meeting their obligations when load actual outcomes are different from load forecasts. That may be even more important. And particularly the result that we found in terms of resource acquisition, keeping in pace with planned resources and load being flat, suggests that there may be many other reasons why resources are procured, not specifically load, and that opens a kind of a question in examining what those other reasons are and how those should be highlighted or maybe examined in more detail in the planning process. I have one last.
Yeah, to elaborate on this point, which is this highlights something that's very important here in terms of how one thinks about these forecast errors. We didn't go into this paper, but perhaps in future research, which is there's clearly asymmetric risk from overestimating or underestimating load growth. Roughly speaking, without pointing any fingers or making any specific claims, a risk of overestimating load growth is possible over procurement or over investment in new generation, whereas a possible risk of under forecasting is not having enough supply. So there are risks, but they're not beyond a certain point. They're not at all the same on the upside or the downside, and so this is something that is very interesting to consider about how one gauges errors in terms of their outcomes in this application, rather than just in terms of their magnitudes. Again, the topic for future research.
Okay, so I have one last question that just got in, a couple of questions that just got in. This is from Claire Broom, says, can you assess impact of policy, for example, energy efficiency programs, either in actual loads or how EE targets should be factored into forecasts? So this is a larger question for sure and a little bit outside of our research program, but still we did discuss this in the sense that we implicitly assumed that the forecasts for energy efficiency and demand response were very accurate compared to actual deployment, because when we net it out of the load forecast itself, we're essentially making that assumption. There have been some studies done by LBNL comparing energy efficiency against actual outcomes and implementations, and we also complemented that in our second paper when examining in more detail the regulatory filings. And what both studies find is that LSCs have generally found more cost-effective DSM than they previously had forecasted and estimated for. So they have acquired more demand-side resources than they initially thought. That may be in part due to the energy policy that forced them to do so, and then essentially created the market for energy efficiency. Maybe in part because there were difficulties in assessing the cost effectiveness of the energy efficiency measures, and so it turned out that they were much cheaper than anticipated. But that's a little bit outside of our scope for now. The second part of this question asks how would energy efficiency targets should be factored into forecasts. And I think that's a very good question and an open question. What we saw is that many LLCs usually divide in two, and they think part of their energy efficiency efforts are incorporated into native load, and they assume a part of them are incorporated into native load. And another part still depends on the program. We did not examine in detail how these two pan out together and what is the balance, but it seems that this is an ongoing issue right now for utilities to understand how prevalent the programs are and how much of the energy efficiency that is adopted stays as adopted and is not later somehow rebounded in different ways. And those two, I think, going back to a comment that Alan made, while these are important, very important analysis that should be carried out, we believe that in the overall effect of energy efficiency is still relatively small at least in the last decade, compared to load growth and the acquisition of other types of resources. There are many reasons why this may be. I mean, it is more like an empirical affirmation, and there may be many reasons why there could be more energy efficiency being acquired. But what we found in the papers, in the reports, is that comparatively, energy efficiency is still, for most of the LLCs, not all, but for most of them, still a small type of resource.
So again, a little bit of elaboration on that point. So as we mentioned earlier, during this time period, that we examined, the DSM and the case studies, at least some of the case studies, where DSM was being taken account of, but the programmatic experience of the LSCs in dealing with it they were still going up the learning curve. And I think it's rough. This is not based on quantitative information, but the appearance is that the more they did it, they first figured out that it worked perhaps better than they'd expected. And so that led to them incorporating it into their future forecasts. So there's a larger effect, but still, it's a question of the relative magnitudes of different drivers. It still appears to be relatively secondary or tertiary to the higher order drivers. So very important point here about the interaction or the relationship between economic growth and DSM and the forecasts, which is that the load growth has sort of flattened since the recession and is nationwide in a lot of cases. Actually, I think the nation as a whole, but also in a lot of jurisdictions, load growth has slowed down. This appears to be primarily because of the economic recession, right? So not entirely. There's a lot going on, but just in terms of the magnitude of the effect, it does not appear to be overall primarily due to DSM. Having said that, what an effect of that is that in jurisdictions where load growth is the baseline is sort of lower than historically, DSM can pick up relatively more of the growth, right? So if you historically had load growth at say 1 or 1.5% per year, and you're now down to say 0.5% per year, the share of your anticipated growth that might be taken care of by demand side measures is accordingly higher. So I think we're seeing this in some of our case studies, and again, it's something to look more closely at in the future.
Thanks, Alan. There's a couple of additional questions. One says, how important is it to have a longer range or period forecast than a short? And this is a very interesting question because it's something we're pondering right now as part of our second paper, but a little bit more broadly. We're thinking about whether plans should span longer periods or shorter periods. And I'll anticipate one of our results from the second paper is that we're espousing the idea of a shorter planning process for several reasons that I will not specify now. And so but we are also supporting the development of a very specific longer-term forecast to mostly detect issues in the position of the utilities and to understand and capture market trends. But this is a question that, rather than answering, I must say that we are actively exploring as part of our second paper, and I hope you can follow up later on with us and when that paper is out in a couple months. The last question asks about we emphasize brownout risks as a driver for overprocurement. How much can today's increasingly effective load shifting programs mitigate this risk? I would say that I did not emphasize. I mostly hypothesize that this was one option, and that we had some evidence of regulators making sure, or regulators incentivizing utilities, particularly after the California crisis, to increase and improve and maintain reliability. And that may explain a little bit the eventual overprocurement. It's true that nowadays there are demand response programs that could provide flexibility and actively provide reserve margins in more efficient ways. But we have to remember that these are plans developed in the early 2000s where these types of products and techniques were not as widely used. So maybe that would explain why we still believe this may be a reason but may not apply to more current plans. Having said that, this is a good kind of counter-argument to why this particular hypothesis may not be as valid or as useful, and then maybe other of the hypotheses that we have been discussing before could play a more important role. But this is a very interesting area of future research to explain the overprocurement and over-forecast relationships that we find in this paper. Seeing no more questions, I want to thank all of the audience that came into our webinar. I'd like to wish you a very good Thanksgiving week for the last part of this week. And stay tuned for both the second paper, the second part of this work that's going to be published hopefully in the next couple months. And also remember that you can visit the resource planning portal to get access to all this data at resourceplanning.lbl.gov. So thank you very much again for your attendance, and have a great week.